hang on to something, because we're about to have fun. Welcome to Best Video Game Console Reviews 2 by Classic Game Room, the second collection of rare, obscure, and downright weird game systems that I've reviewed over the years, like the Panasonic 3DO Neo Geo CDZ, the TurboGrafx 16 Sega SG-1000 Halo Xbox, and let's kick this off with one of my all-time favorite Classic Game Room reviews. It's the Nintendo Game Boy Micro. Dig it. Banished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the intergalactic space arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Welcome to Classic Game Room. There's lots of excellent Game Boys and Game Boy Advances to choose from, but what if you've been hit by a shrink ray? Then you might want the Game Boy Micro. It's big action
on the small screen
with Game Boy Micro. That was weird. Let's never do that again. Released in 2005, the Game Boy Micro is an adorable little Game Boy Advance with a backlit screen and lots and lots and lots of games to play on it. If you've been watching this show for a while, you know that I love the Game Boy Advance. I think it's a terrific handheld game system, the backlit screen models at least. I love the Game Boy Advance SP in particular, and I really like this one. It's sleek, it's sophisticated, and it reeks of class. Oh yeah, we get some harp music and the legendary Starfy 3. This thing will play all Game Boy Advance games, Western releases, Japanese releases, but sadly, unlike the Game Boy Advance SP, it will not play Game Boy or Game Boy Color, or Sega Game Gear, or Neo Geo MVS game cartridges. Those won't work either. Primarily because they just won't fit. Kind of annoying actually, I wish Nintendo had thought of this. But they seem to have gotten everything else right. For starters, it's a great-looking handheld. The screen is bright, vibrant, and filled with all of the detail and quality that you can expect from a good Game Boy Advance game. Now, if it's a crappy game, this isn't going to make it any better. Yes, I'm looking at you, Starsky and Hutch. You suck. But Mark, you may say, there's other things that play Game Boy Advance games like the Nintendo DS Lite, the Game Boy Advance, or the Game Boy Advance SP, which isn't in this shot, but you can see how much smaller the Game Boy Micro is. And how much classier. It's just a better looking game system, isn't it? It's got a comfortable, functional D-pad, working buttons, and those two top buttons, as well as a great-looking screen. It even works with headphones that output audio to your ears. Nintendo thinks of everything except Neo Geo MVS compatibility. They totally dropped the ball on that one. But the Game Boy Micro is smaller than a Neo Geo MVS game cartridge. It's also smaller than the actual MVS arcade machine. It's smaller than an El Camino. It's more compact than Edit Station 1, who not only has a broken brake key but a missing one. The Nintendo Game Boy Micro will even fit inside a Sega Genesis. But not for long when there's Truxton to be played. It'll fit into a cup of coffee, in the fridge. You can even hit people with it. The Game Boy Micro makes the perfect dancing partner, but most importantly, it plays great games well. And isn't that the most important thing? Now, if you're looking for a bigger backlit screen, may I suggest the Game Boy Advance SP or the Nintendo DS Lite. But for those of you who are smaller or looking for something more compact with style, class, and sophistication, then I highly recommend the excellent Game Boy Micro. So a huge, giant, enormous Classic Game Room shout out and thank you to Isaiah from Southport, North Carolina for sending this to the show. It's a terrific little handheld, one that can be found in a variety of colors and styles, but I like the silver and black one. I think it's really cool. There's loads of excellent Game Boy Advance games and a bunch of lousy ones, but this is an excellent way to play the good ones, even in the vacuum of space.
Anyone? Let me in.
The following review has been approved by Lord Carnage and the best of Classic Game Room. Welcome to Classic Game Room, where I'm armed and ready to review the Nintendo Entertainment System Power Up! Released in 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System was the hot game system in the mid to late 80s, at least in the United States. Its iconic shape, flip-up door, and ejecting games are what an entire generation remembers as its first game console. Who can forget this design? Just look at it. Nothing else looks remotely like the NES. I think that it's Nintendo's best-looking game console by far. In fact, it's even better looking than the Wii. It's true. I love the type font on the buttons. I like the look of the controller ports. I like everything about the NES. Especially Contra and Bionic Commando. It'll work with line-out audio and video or an RF adapter. Many of us just refer to this thing as the Nintendo. But this is not my Nintendo. I'm actually borrowing Derek's for this review because my Nintendo is broken. A common problem with these after about 30 years. What made the NES worth owning back in the day was its amazing collection of games. Releases started out slowly in 1985 as the US was emerging from a video game recession. In a few years' time, the NES library would boast hundreds of titles, many of which remain iconic classics to this day. Here's a look at just a few of them. And apparently Nintendo was more selective about what games would end up on its system, unlike Atari. So always look for the official Nintendo seal of quality. But wait, did you know the NES wasn't always the NES? In 1983, Nintendo released the 8-bit family computer, which is basically the NES. Except it looks like this. I like the styling on the NES a lot better. But I do admire these controllers, they're kind of cool. It's too bad they got rid of that little ejecting thing for the NES, but at least it returns on the Super Nintendo. If you were a kid in the US in the mid-80s, there was only one game system to own. The Atari 7800 Pro system. When I was a kid, I chose Atari because I loved Atari, and it was cheap in about 1987, 1988 because nobody wanted one. The NES was expensive. But wait, a lot of you chose another option, the 8-bit Sega Master System. Commercially, at least in the United States, the NES destroyed them all, thanks largely in part to third-party support and amazing games like... oh no, this one came out many years later. Disregard that. What I like about the NES, in addition to the games, are its cool peripherals like the NES Advantage, the NES Zapper. Even the gamepad is pretty nice. How about the Power Glove and Rob the Robot? I don't have Rob the Robot, and the Power Glove that we do have around here doesn't work, but it would be cool if it did, right? I mean, just imagine a future dominated by roaming Rob the Robots and Power Gloves that actually worked. It would be amazing. It would be the NES Advantage. So let me get this straight. You want NES fanboy Mark to sit here and play Twin Cobra with the NES Advantage all day? Okay. Woo! Before you just downloaded video games from the internet, playing NES was an experience because the cartridges themselves were cool. Many of them had nice artwork, they had those cool ridges, and you would push them into the NES and then lock them down into place. Don't forget to close the blast shield to protect yourself from all the 8-bit power. But is it worth owning today, since there's a wide variety of ways to play these games? Well, purists will say yes. Just be prepared to replace those 72-pin connectors if they go bad. Hey, if you want the real NES experience and you're gonna play with the Zapper and the Advantage, you want the real NES. Performance-wise, it's great. It's the NES. I think most of you watching have played it before. It's good. There's really no question.
Yes!
Of course, that also depends on what game you're playing.
I've seen C-beams burning off the coast of Jersey.
The best thing about the NES is its enormous collection of games. We've got everything from Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt to Twin Cobra and World Games and Bionic Commando and Operation Wolf and so many more. Great games, great peripherals, great design, great performance. What's not to love about the NES? Sure, it might be prone to breakage after about 3 or 4 decades, but what isn't? Couldn't resist that one, come on. Sure, there's other ways to enjoy the Nintendo games these days, but there's only one NES. Actually, there is more than one, but this is the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Happy hunting, because they still hold their value. At least the ones that are still working after all these years. You've got to have respect for antique, obsolete technology that still functions. I think that last comment was aimed at me. I'm obsolete, but I kind of function most of the time. Better than the Power Glove, at least. This thing doesn't work at all. Oh, no, my bad. It turned off the review. The best of classic Game Room is on DVD, Blu-ray, and Laser Hypervision album set. What's this button do? Whoa. What happens if the Power Glove and the Sonic hands touch each other? Welcome to Classic Game Room for the review of the Sega Genesis Arcade Motion game system, which plays Sega Genesis games with motion controls or some games with motion control. I don't know. Color me skeptical. Finally, after all these years, someone figured out what the Sega Genesis had been missing all along: motion controls. Enter the Sega Genesis Arcade Motion game console from AtGames. This is a battery-powered motion-sensing console with interactive sports and Sega TV games. That's sort of shaped like Sonic the Hedgehog, and it's blue. It has wireless controllers, 15 Sega games, 7 interactive sports games, and 18 bonus arcade games. Plus, you can play more with an SD card from download. Wow, welcome to the future of the Sega Genesis. A future that terrifies me, because I've been less than impressed with most of these aftermarket Sega Genesis game consoles. They're typically subpar, to say the least. And actual Sega hardware is always the way to go, but I'm giving this thing a fair chance to prove that it's not complete garbage. At first glance, it looks pretty cheap. It looks like one of these game systems that could have had any game or logo stamped on it. And for this one, they just chose the Sega Genesis, filled it with a few games and some cheap motion controllers. Here you go. I've reviewed some other AtGames consoles, and while they have a lot of games, the sound quality is usually horrible, but they serve a purpose, lots of games for cheap. And this one gives you the addition of motion controls. But don't be fooled, you're not going to play most of the Genesis or Mega Drive games with the motion controls. Now, it's pretty obvious what this was aiming for: the incredibly successful and wildly popular Nintendo Wii. The controllers are almost exact replicas, albeit much, much cheaper. There's no HDMI to be found. Oh no, you'll have mono audio and composite video. State of the art in like 1985. Here's your black and white instruction manual getting you started with the games, including Mr. Balls. At first glance, I read that as Mr. Balls gets caught in a mystery machine. Sounds painful, but hey, none of these real Sega game systems play Mr. Balls. Not like the Genesis Arcade Motion. To start it up, you push the on-off switch and the AtGames logo comes up. Pair your controller, which I already did. Alright, we've got 3 exciting options here to choose from: Sega Mega Drive games, arcade games, and SD card, as well as interactive sports games. Let's start with the Mega Drive. It's got Aero Flash. Alright, that's a point in its good column. Crackdown, that's a decent game. Like the other AtGames consoles I've used, the games play more or less like the Genesis originals. It plays fairly well, looks good on screen. You'll hold the controller horizontally like the Wii controller to play these games, and the controller is wireless. But as I predicted, the sound quality is downright terrible. Presumably, if you see this thing out there, you're probably gonna buy it for the motion controls though, right? It's like a Wii, except a whole lot less expensive.
Yes.
And that makes complete sense because it's a whole lot less good. This is such a desperate, half-assed attempt to recreate the excellent Wii Sports that fails miserably.
This game robbed me of a strike. That was definitely a strike.
This is clearly aimed at a younger audience, but if you love your children, buy them a real Sega Genesis or a real Nintendo Wii. In fact, most of the Genesis games that you can get on here, if not all of them, are available on the Virtual Console.
This is how I normally fight, so I'm right at home with this. Ow! Get away from me.
But wait, there's more. What about the arcade games? We still haven't played Mr. Balls yet.
Fish Story, blah blah blah. Mr. Balls. Derek!
Hi, Mark.
Do you want to come out and play a game with me called Mr. Balls?
Who reads the instructions?
Well, we have to read the instructions to Mr. Balls. Because I can't figure out how to play Mr. Balls. I have space for one ball that I need to fill with a ball. How do I...
Hit that ball.
Which ball should I hit? Release or lock onto one of your balls. Those who are at your left, right, above, and below switch the state. If they were free, they would get lock. If they were lock, they would get free. There are many initial machine configurations to be solved, including that one which is random. Now I've done it. I've gotten my balls out of alignment.
I hate it when that happens. I've got a big classic game room shout out and thank you to send to Brian from Canton, Ohio. Thank you for sending Mr. Balls.
Shall we play baseball, bowling, casual fishing,
and the Sega Genesis Arcade Motion game system to the show?
It's literally called casual fishing.
Casual fishing, just laid back fishing.
As opposed to like really serious fishing.
I just throw some dynamite in the pond and wait for them to float.
There's a
on.
feature where you can also download games and put them onto an SD card from their website or something, or you can just save your money and not buy this. Spend it on a real Sega Genesis instead.
I'm getting a workout. Oh. This is it, kids. The TurboGrafx 16 released in 1987 in Japan and 1989 in the United States. It's known as the PC Engine in Japan. We get games like Keith Courage in Alpha Zones and Blazing Lasers on this thing. Developed by Hudson Soft and NEC, the TurboGrafx 16 has some very cool games, but did not have nearly the lifespan or following of the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. What do you do when this is your competition? Two of the greatest game consoles ever created. Well, you don't have as many games. The TurboGrafx 16 has some nice exclusives, and it's cool to see a number of them on the Wii Virtual Console available for download these days. But let's take a look at this thing. It's kind of cool and very different from today's game consoles. You get these little cards. The Who card. Hue card. I don't know how you pronounce that, and I don't care. I feel like if I insert this into an ATM, it will give me back cash, but it doesn't. If I insert this into an NEC TurboGrafx 16, it will give me back an ass whooping in Blazing Lasers. Alright, check this out. I think this is pretty cool. This is where you insert the card, the game, into your TurboGrafx 16. We'll put Blazing Lasers in here. There's an arrow indicating what direction to insert the card, so you don't accidentally try to pull it in from this direction, which doesn't work. I tried it. You go like this. You take it, insert it into there, fits into place. It's even got a little handy space down there for your human fingers. Very clever. And then when you turn on the power, it'll lock it into place with a restraining bolt. Look at that, and it turns red, letting you know it's angry. The TurboGrafx 16 does not want this game escaping when you're playing it. This is where you insert the game controller. Notice that there's only one slot, or one port, for one game controller. Big drawback for this system, you have to buy a separate accessory to play more than one controllers, to play with more than one controllers. We'll insert the turbo pad into here like this, and there you go. I've previously reviewed the turbo pad. It's a pretty nice gamepad. Feels like the NES gamepad with slightly rounder edges and the tower of TurboGrafx 16. The TurboGrafx 16 is a very affordable game console these days, and the games don't cost that much either. It's not as much fun to collect for as the Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo, in my opinion, because there aren't as many games out for it, and the really good games are actually available on Nintendo's Virtual Console for the Wii, at least many of the good games. Now, if you go out places like eBay, or virtually go out, I guess you're not really going out unless you go outside in your laptop and shop on eBay, but if you go to eBay, you can find a number of games at very reasonable prices. Take a look here at Keith Courage in Alpha Zones. The games that are well known on the TurboGrafx 16 are spaceship shooter style games and arcade games. The mascot for the TurboGrafx 16 that they were pushing was Bonk. Just in case you weren't sure what game console you have, it tells you in very bright lettering, TurboGrafx 16, where graphics is spelled with an X because it's cooler that way, I guess. Here's your antenna switch. This has no line-out AV output, so you can't just do standard audio and video RCA cables out of this thing. You have to use an RF switch like you do with the Atari 2600. So unfortunately, the video quality that the TurboGrafx 16 outputs is not nearly as good as the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis. It's not to say the graphics aren't good, but you're not going to get as clear and sharp a video output. Let's take a look at the back of this thing. You can see they've made it smoother like that with this plastic molded add-on thing. If we take that off, which is a little tricky there we go. You can see it's actually a very small game console. Pretty light too. There were some accessories that worked with the TurboGrafx 16, like a CD drive. And this is the power cord that plugs in back there and is tucked away neatly when you put the cover on. Here's the TurboGrafx 16 adapter to work with your television, very similar to what you would use for the Atari 2600. And you can see this is the same kind of plug. I typically use a VCR to pass the signal through an old school game console like this into a modern television, converting the signal to composite RCA video and stereo audio, or at least simulated stereo audio. And you take this thing here and plug this into the side of your TurboGrafx 16. It's unfortunate this does not have line-out AV like the Super Nintendo, which looks awesome. You know, the upside with the TurboGrafx 16 is that there's games available for it that you won't find on other game consoles. The downside is that you're not going to walk into one of those stores where you can buy stacks of Sega Genesis games and Nintendo cartridges and find TurboGrafx 16 games, or at least not very many of them. So I tend to tell people, if you want to play some TurboGrafx 16 games, go to your Nintendo Wii and download them from the Virtual Console because they look amazing, and games like Blazing Lasers are incredibly fun. This would be just as much fun if it was on any other game console. It's just that this happened to be made for the TurboGrafx 16. And it's called Blazing Lasers. It kicks ass. Watch my review of this game. If you had a TurboGrafx 16 back in the day, it's easy to relive the experience because they're affordable today. They're not rare, but they're not exactly in high demand either. And look at this, the games come in little sleeves, keeping them safe, keeping them comfortable, keeping them warm. They play better when they're happy. And a giant thanks to John in Wisconsin for donating the TurboGrafx 16. He wants to make sure that I give a shout out to Ms. Thiel's Emerging Technologies class at Milwaukee Area Technical College. Let's talk about emerging technologies. You know what's an emerging technology? the TurboGrafx 16. I couldn't think of anything else.
Welcome to a special classic game room, because today I'm bringing you the review of the Sega SG-1000 Mark II, because 2 marks are always better than 1. Did you think that the Sega Master System was Sega's first game console? Guess again, it's the Sega SG-1000. Originally released in 1983, this is the Mark II model, which came out in 1984. Such a great year, Van Halen made an entire album about it. Computer video game. This was meant to compete with Nintendo's Famicom, the family home computer. It plays game cartridges, and while it's not much to look at, it does a good job. Also, it's a classic Sega, and as a Sega fanboy, this makes me very happy. Sadly, they didn't learn from the Atari 2600 and put the controller ports on the back, but check this out. The SG-1000 describes itself on the top of the game console. A fun-packed console designed for simple operation. Its colorful gameplay is sure to test your skills, sharpen your reflexes, and greatly enlarge your imagination. While this is a very obscure game system in the United States at least, they never released it in America, there's a huge catalog of nice games, many of which should be very familiar to you. I've only got a few of them here, but so far I'm impressed, and hold on to your seats! It's the Sega Card Catcher, which catches cards and plays them. Try that, Famicom! These are really neat, and as far as I can tell, they're exactly like the cards you would find for the Sega Master System, which had some games in card form. I love the artwork for this one. Zoom 909 is a really cool game. And you may be wondering, does this work on Western or American televisions? Yes, it does, and I'll show you that momentarily. Let's look at the controller, which I actually don't have. So I'm using a Sega Master System controller. 2-button controller works perfectly. As I understand it, the Sega Genesis controller is not as compatible. The SG-1000 Mark II is roughly the same size as the Sega Master System. It's super light, but it feels like it has a nice build quality. It actually feels a lot like the Master System. I don't have the original power supply, but this one, with these numbers, works just fine. To play this thing, you're going to need to tune your television to channel 96. So it's kind of like using the Famicom, except it's a Sega. Even if many of the games are pretty basic, like Lode Runner, seen here, the PC Classic, looks great and plays well on the Sega SG-1000 Mark II. And everybody around the Intergalactic Space Arcade thinks that guy is collecting Chex Mix, which always makes me hungry every time I play this game. Now let's step it up to Starjacker, which demonstrates what the SG-1000 can do with sound. It's amazing. Not only is this game fun to play, it's music to the ears. Let's check out Zoom 909, one of the Sega My Cards. This one's got a Galaxy Force thing to it. As you can see, if you like old Sega games or old arcade games in general, the Sega SG-1000 Mark II is a super cool game system to own. There's a lot of games out there for it. It works with a Master System controller. That's always a good thing. But wait, there's more. Because as I was filming this review, what should arrive here in outer space? Why, it's the Mark III. It's the next one, which looks similar. As you can see, they moved the joystick controller ports to the front and added a card reader, just like the Master System. What's the difference between the two? You know, I really haven't spent much time with the Mark III yet. I'll cover that in its review. In theory, 3 marks should be better than 2, but 2 marks is terrific, especially when they both come from Sega. One of my favorite games to date has got to be Bomb Jack. I love Bomb Jack. I've actually got this in my 16-1 arcade machine. I'll tell you right now, Starjacker and Bomb Jack are my two favorite games on the Mark II. Sadly, Truxton does not play on it. If you love old school games and are a diehard Sega fanatic, then the Sega SG-1000 is a game system for you. It's a collector's item for sure, but it works really well. There's a lot of great games for it, and it's not prohibitively expensive. However, I have a super massive Sega-sized thank you to send once again to Mark and Suzanne from Fresh Meadows, New York. Thank you again. Thank you for opening up the world of SG-1000 reviews with the fantastic Mark II. And Chris from New Jersey sent the Mark III, so I think we'll have to have a Mark II versus Mark III deathmatch for the next review. Until then, it's Sega SG-1000 time here on Classic Game Room Mark II.
That's a lot of green surrounding the Xbox logo. It's the Halo Special Edition Xbox from Microsoft. And you know it to be true when it's green and says Halo Special Edition right on the front. This was originally released in 2004 and came with a copy of Halo Combat Evolved. An excellent game worthy of its own Xbox for sure. I think this green see-through one is extremely cool. It lets you get a glimpse at the magic hiding inside of the Xbox. It's also just a cool color. Why get the dull original one when you could get this? Make your friends green with envy that you're playing on the Zobix. Wait, sorry. Always have that problem with this thing. Xbox. This is actually the first original Xbox that I've ever owned. And a special thank you to Mohammed in Qatar for donating the Halo Special Edition Xbox to the show, because there's a number of games that aren't compatible with the Xbox 360, and the original Xbox is the way to go when playing them. Let's open this up. And then you could take your copy of Halo, insert it into the drive, and play the game. This isn't hooked up to a TV right now, but you would insert the disc like Halo 2, shut the drive, and start playing after you insert the controller to actually play the game. There's not many reasons to buy an old school Xbox these days because most of the Xbox games are playable on the Xbox 360. Now, some of them have issues like Outrun 2, which doesn't play perfectly on the 360, so you might want an original Xbox for a game like that. And let's be honest, if you're going to get an Xbox, you may as well get the Halo Special Edition Xbox because it looks really cool and says Halo Special Edition right on the front. It's also a really nice green. It just brightens up the room. Here's the back, power cable goes there, AV output is there, and that's where the Ethernet cable plugs in. The Xbox is a giant game console. It's extremely heavy and certainly feels like you're getting a lot for your money. Not that you'll have to spend all that much to get one these days. In fact, they're relatively affordable. There's a lot of them out there. Even the Halo Special Edition Xbox is not a rare item, but it is fun to have for collectors. Approved by the Mini-Mates version of Master Chief, it's the Halo Special Edition Xbox. I think see-through game consoles are cool, like the see-through blue Dreamcast, and there's the gray one. There's a whole bunch of different Xboxes. You could collect them all if you have the room. You could use these things as weights, they're so heavy, and get a workout, lifting them, building muscles like Master Chief. Does he have muscles?
Banished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the Intergalactic Space Arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Welcome to Classic Game Room for the review of the Retron 5 video game system. Is it good? Is it bad? Let's find out. It does come with a pack of stickers that you can stick on things. Let's go have some fun. The top of the sticker should say, "I'm not supported by the Retron 5. No 3DO." May as well just end the review here. This is the Retron 5 video game console from Hyperkin, a game system that plays at least 5 different kinds of video games, but as you'll see, it does even more than that. And there's quite a bit of controversy surrounding this thing on the internet. Controversy over a video game system. If you're fortunate enough to find controversy in video games, you're doing pretty well in life. I have running water, but damn it, it doesn't play GameCube. Grr. Well, no it doesn't, but what it does do is play Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Nintendo Entertainment System, Famicom, and Game Boy Advance. And a few more including Sega Master System, Super Famicom, Game Boy, and Game Boy Color. It also works with the real controllers, the old school NES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis gamepads. Which is good because the controller this comes with is horrible. Sadly, you can't throw it away though because you need it to control the Retron 5. Now let's see if this plays Fairchild Channel F. No. A major oversight. Come on, Hyperkin. Also, where's the analog video outputs? This does HDMI. And just HDMI, and that's fine if all you have is an LCD or flat screen or whatever, but old school purists are gonna hate this thing. If you refuse to play Sega Genesis on anything less than an actual Genesis, just forget the Retron 5. What it really does is somewhat unclear to me. I thought it played emulated versions of the games. Everyone tells me I'm wrong, it rips the ROMs off the game cartridges or something. I don't know. It definitely doesn't work the same way a real Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo does because it's outputting digital versions of the game through HDMI. And it's interesting, this is like an imperfect solution to a problem that you would be lucky to have. I have 1,000 video games across 10 different platforms, but I don't have the game consoles to play it. Well, the Retron 5 will do that for you. It plays just about anything you throw at it, provided it's not a Neo Geo. Now, I've been tinkering with this for a few weeks now. There's some things I like about it and stuff I don't like about it. For starters, it looks and feels really cheap. The controller that it comes with is terrible. Its only function is to navigate the menus in the Retron 5. To play any of the games, you'll want the real controllers. It seems defective coming out of the box because it says to push the power button to turn on the Retron 5 when in fact you need to hold down the power button for about 5 seconds. Do that before you return it. Although you may want to return it anyway after you realize it's nearly impossible to get games out of this once they're inserted. It just holds onto them for dear life and refuses to let go. Which is fine if all you want to play is Thunder Force 2, because why would you stop playing Thunder Force 2? The thing is, it just feels wrong. Something about this is strange. It's not playing the games the normal way, which is why it won't play Pure Solar for the Sega Genesis. So it's like this strange paradox. It looks great on an LCD screen. It does. It really looks good. And they give you lots of different filter options and scanline options and stuff, and it's in glorious HD, but it has that pure digital emulated look, which isn't real. I don't have an engineering term for you. I draw a comic book about a squid that flies in space. That's as deep as I get. So just know that it won't play your games through analog. There is no analog. On the plus side, it does play PAL, it plays Super Famicom, it plays Japanese Game Boy, it even works with the Sega Genesis power base converter so you can play Sega Master System games. Have you ever wanted to play Game Boy with a Sega Genesis controller? Yes, you can do that. So, the Retron 5 has some tricks up its sleeve. And it'll save your games onto an SD card, allowing you to have backups. Although that did totally freak me out the first time I put Super Metroid in, and it ripped my saved game data onto the Retron 5 and erased it off my Super Metroid cartridge. And I was about to stomp on this thing until I figured out I could copy it back onto the game cartridge. I have no idea how they do this. In any event, if it seems like you've lost your saved game data, check the menus. It's most likely in the Retron 5. It's out to destroy you. So anyway, it does work. Although I'm a little confused about who the market is for this, because real old school collectors are going to have all the old game systems, and the casual audience just looking to play some old school games on their big screen TV are going to be let down by the awful controller that it comes with. But that's not to say it doesn't work. It does work. It plays the games, somehow. So if you're going to give this as a gift to a friend, a relative, or whatever, make sure to send along a real Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo controller, so they can actually enjoy the games. And yes, in many cases you can play NES and Game Boy with a Sega Genesis gamepad. Let's feed the bunny those things. I don't know what that is. Soylent Green! Rabbits love people! Protein. It does do a few things really well. For starters, the Game Boy Advance, and Game Boy Color output is stunning. There's no borders around the screen. It looks great. I love this thing for the Game Boy games. That's probably its biggest strength, for me at least. Game Boy and Game Boy Advance over HDMI with no borders. I like that. I also like that it plays PAL, Super Nintendo, and Super Famicom. I like that after you figure it out, you can back up your save game data. The Retron 5 has its place, but it's really up to you to decide where that place is. So on that note, I've got a huge classic game room shout out and thank you to send to Ahmed from Springfield Gardens, New York, for sending this to the show. Thank you, Ahmed, once again. I hope this cleared up some of the mystery out there surrounding the Retron 5. It does not do analog video output. It's HDMI only. And it doesn't play Neo Geo, Sega CD, Famicom Disk, Gamecom, Fairchild, Channel F, or Vita or PlayStation, Magnavox Odyssey 2, Xbox One. What the hell does it do? You know, just screw it all. Buy a Neo Geo. And now the rabbit is passed out after eating all that Soylent Green.
This giant beast is the Panasonic 3DO video game console, which was released to the US market in 1993 and retailed for about $700, putting it well out of the reach of most potential consumers back in the day when you could buy a Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo for far less. But the Panasonic 3DO plays optical media and had a library full of early 90s full-motion video style games. Just look at some of the titles that you can play on this thing. Nova Storm, The Need for Speed, Super Wing Commander, the amazing 3DO version of Road Rash, the iconic Myst, and of course, Syndicate. The packaging for many of the old school 3DO games looks like this, and you can open it up and check it out. There's the game disc for Shockwave. Let's take that out of there. Same size as a standard CD or DVD. This is your eject button. And there's a lot of games that were released for this. The problem with collecting for the 3DO today is that it's hard to find a working 3DO game console. Sadly, even though the price of Panasonic 3DO game consoles is a fraction of what it used to be, they're prone to failure. And if you're buying a used one, make sure whoever you're buying it from gives you a warranty, or at least can promise up and down that the thing works. This is the original Panasonic 3DO, the model FZ1, which has one controller port, it has S-video output, and it feels like a really nice piece of home theater equipment. It's big and hefty, and later they released the Panasonic 3DO model FZ10, which has a cheaper CD-style tray and a controller that no longer has the headphone jack. So they obviously cut costs in response to this thing not selling well, because it was so unbelievably expensive. Although the model FZ10 will also give you the S-video output. Here's what the back of the 3DO looks like. As one who played video games in the early 90s, I like the style of many of the games available on the Panasonic 3DO. It's a very unique style that seemed to go away quickly after the early 90s. Many of the games available on the 3DO are also available for other game consoles, like Rebel Assault, which I reviewed for the Sega CD. But the 3DO version is a lot better. What really set the 3DO apart from the Genesis and the Super Nintendo was its collection of 3D style games and live motion video. Many of these games are enhanced with really awesome cutscenes that feature live actors, not just CGI graphics. Games like Myst and Road Rash are great on this thing, but you can also get a lot of the titles available for the 3DO on other game consoles, like the first Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. So is it worth buying a 3DO and starting a game collection? Well, maybe. That depends on your dedication level. It's like the Atari 5200 or the Intellivision. It's an impractical game console. If something goes wrong, you've just got to buy another one, and that can get expensive. If you can find a Panasonic 3DO for a reasonable price with a massive collection of games like I did, then it's worth buying. But I should note, the Panasonic 3DO I bought with all of the games doesn't work. This 3DO was sent to the show by our good friend Mohammed in Qatar, and this one does work. It took 3 tries to find one that worked. It is far easier to collect for the Sega Saturn, Sega CD, or PlayStation than the 3DO, but in many cases you'll find unique games on the 3DO that you won't find elsewhere, or far superior versions of similar games on the 3DO. It was a premium game system, like the Neo Geo. And like the Neo Geo, you were going to pay for it. Even though the Panasonic 3DO only has one controller port, you could daisy chain controllers together, which is kind of an odd feature. And that's the Panasonic 3DO, premium game console with an awesome library of games. You really can't go wrong with a lot of these. So once again, a giant thank you to our friend Mohammed in Qatar. I think it's time to play some Space Ace on the Panasonic 3DO. It would help if I had this hooked up to a TV right now. I'm gonna turn this off, stop recording, move it to the TV, and then play some Space Ace. Oh, this game is awesome. And it looks like it came from Babbage's.
So, how do you play NES? With the NES, that's pretty good, but how about this thing? The Analogue NT is carved out of a single block of aluminum and uses the original Nintendo hardware. You can plug 4 Nintendo controllers into the front of it. It speaks German. The Analogue NT can see the future, and the future is more Analogue NT. Provided you can afford it. If your daily driver is a Bugatti, you'll be right at home with this. I've made up the part about it speaking German, but it does kick ass. And it damn well better for the price. The good news is you get your money's worth. From the same evil geniuses who brought us the all-wood consoleized Neo Geo CMVS Slim comes the all-metal Analogue NT, which plays NES and Famicom games. This outputs S-video, composite video, and component video. You can also upgrade it to HDMI. Why doesn't it play Sega 32X? I've been using this lately for a bunch of reviews, including Twin Cobra, Famicom, Rally 2, Falchion, and Bird Week. Inserting and removing games is a luxurious experience. It doesn't try to grip onto them and never let go like some other aftermarket NESs I've reviewed. But as they'll remind you, this is something special. How special can it be if it doesn't play the 32X? Come on. Pretty darned special. Even without Sega 32X compatibility, the Analogue NT is the best NES and Famicom that I've ever used. The question is, will it be the best NES and Famicom that you've ever used? Likely, it will. If $500 doesn't really sound like a big deal to you. The price is astronomical, but look at what you get, an NES made from metal. That's like a Sega Genesis made out of plastic. Spectacular! I love the AV outputs in the back. You can do stereo audio or mix that together into mono. They'll send along some high-quality video cables. And here it is working with the mighty Famicom disk system. I don't know how Analogue Interactive can one-up themselves until they craft an Atari 2600 out of licorice. I'm trying to come up with something super clever so I can get quoted on their website. If the original NES is Jar Jar Binks, the Analogue NT is Lando Calrissian, lighting Jar Jar on fire with a flamethrower. It's a beautiful piece of equipment, it looks great, but to be perfectly honest, its best feature is the audio. I've never heard NES and Famicom games sound this good. And I'm a total audio dork, I'm really into this stuff, so if you love NES music and the classic Famicom songs and Super Mario Brothers and whatnot, you're gonna love the Analogue NT, if you can afford it. If you don't want the stereo audio, you can mix that into mono. Sure, it's expensive, it's a luxury item. This is aimed at the retro gamer who already has everything. Except this. Sure, there's far cheaper ways to play NES and Famicom, but this is probably the best. If price is no option, you go Analogue NT, and besides, you can always tell your friends Analogue Interactive does what Nintendo don't. They make playing Bird Week cool. Evolve into a monster bird! Or not. Just give me a bonus, whatever. How do you shoot things in this game? It's the Bentley CompuVision of metal Nintendos. It's the Analogue NT. Look at the detail on those birds. Remember, kids, no emulation. This is the original CPU and PPU and will even output the auxiliary Famicom audio channel. It plays Macross, it plays Falchion, it plays Zelda, it plays a lot of stuff. Thanks to Chris and to my friends over at Analogue Interactive for loaning me this. I really don't want to send it back, though. I suppose that the decent thing to do is to send it back to them. It's a nice game system. I like the Analogue NT. And I'm sad to see it leave. So, thank you, Analogue Interactive. Allow me to present the Sega Genesis Flashback with 85 built-in games including Sonic the Hedgehog, Phantasy Star 2, 3, and 4, as well as the Mortal Kombat games on Sega Genesis and Shinobi 3. 85 built-in games, but not all of them are Sega Genesis games. I'll get to that in a moment. This is from AtGames, who has released some questionable Sega Genesis-related products in the past. This is my favorite one to date because it includes built-in games, but it also plays real Sega Genesis cartridges via HDMI, and that's something that your NES Classic and SNES Classic won't do. It's hard to not compare this directly to the miniature Nintendos since it looks and attempts to feel like a miniature Sega Genesis. It's just not quite up to the Nintendo level of quality. It's close, but they cut a few corners and it shows. On the whole, I'm pretty impressed with it. This comes with 2 wireless controllers. They're like that Sega Genesis Model 3 controller, so not the best Genesis controllers. Hopefully you have a couple originals because this will also work with your old school wired Sega Genesis controllers. While it comes with a bunch of built-in games, what's most exciting is that it just plays the real ones. Like Crystal's Ponytail. Who's not excited about playing Crystal's Ponytail on the big screen in HD? How about some Truxton? That's a better game. Herzog Zwei, Musha, Revenge of Shinobi. This will play them, and that's its greatest
feature, it plays real Sega Genesis games with the real controllers via HDMI, and it's pretty good. Where it drops the ball completely is the menu interface. It's cheap. It just feels cheap, and it doesn't need to. They could just spend a bit more time on the menu interface, like put some music in the background or something. It's just a bit clunky. Doesn't feel nearly as nice as the NES Classic or SNES Classic, but beyond that, it does work. And there's a bunch of Sega Genesis games in here.
Rise from your grave.
Like Altered Beast, which looks and plays well, as you can see. Functionally, this thing works just fine. You plug it in, and it plays games, 85 built-in games, which breaks down to about 63 Sega games, and about half of them are Sega Genesis games. The rest of them are split between Master System and Game Gear. So there's actually a lot of good games in here, including Fantasy Zone, The Maze, and the original Phantasy Star. As well as the Ninja and Sonic Drift 2, so I can't really complain about the game selection, except that for some reason they go out of their way to add 20 just cheap-ass knockoff games that do nothing except give me a reason to complain about it. You could have taken that space and added Truxton, for example. This is the best Sega Genesis plug-and-play game system that I've seen yet, and I love that they included Fantasy Zone, The Maze, and The Ninja, and there's some really good Game Gear games in here. If you're just getting into Sega Genesis collecting, this is a nice choice because it plugs right into your modern LCD TV. It plays original games, so you can go out and get some used games at the game store, and you get about 40 or so Sega Genesis games built into it, Golden Axe 1, 2, and 3. It's got Arrow Flash, which is better than any of the Mario or Zelda games, but this has a hard time competing against the wonderful NES and SNES Classic because Nintendo did such a nice job with those. However, again, I gotta keep coming back to this one point. This plays your original Sega Genesis games. We're going to use the shot of Vector Man rocking out to the beat as my comparison. Here's Vector Man 2, my game cartridge being played on the Sega Genesis Flashback. So just memorize this image here. Looks pretty good. And here's Vector Man 2 being played from within the Sega Genesis Flashback, the version of Vector Man 2 that's built into the Flashback. Now, we're going to step it up to some real blast processing. Vector Man 2 being played on my original Sega Genesis, outputting SCART to a FrameMeister. Yes, it's better, but it also costs about 10 times as much. The original one isn't as bright or oversaturated, so you can see more details in the shadows. Makes a big difference in the dark sections of these games. And you can also adjust the image within the FrameMeister, so it's not really a fair comparison. The AtGames Sega Genesis Flashback is a great value-priced alternative. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement. Sure, it comes with a bunch of built-in games, but its strength is that it plays your existing library of Sega Genesis games or your new and growing library of Sega Genesis games. If you're in the market for a PlayStation 2, you might want to avoid one of the older larger ones. Due to some reliability issues, these got a lot of use. Many of them stopped reading discs after a few years. And why even bother buying a used one when the new ones are affordable and a fraction of the size? This is the model 79001 PlayStation 2. When looking for the specific model number, all you need to do is look underneath and you see SCPH 79001. The tiny little PlayStation 2, which plays all of the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1 games that you'll ever need. Just look at the difference in size between these two. They have similar styling cues, as you can see with the plastic ridges in the front. They work with the same controllers, the same memory cards. If you're upgrading PlayStation 2s or replacing one if it started having problems, you'll be able to use all of the same accessories and play all the games. It's just a lot smaller. This has an external power supply, the 79001, compared to the internal power supply in the much larger one. Still has 2 memory card ports, some USB inputs down here, and it even has a built-in network port in the back, as well as optical audio output. I typically like bigger, larger, heavier things when playing video games. Like controllers should be larger and heavier than the game console itself. That rule doesn't apply to the PlayStation 2 though. Smaller is better. The new PlayStation 2s are better than the original. They do the same thing, but they're so much lighter and smaller and more efficient. They take up less space, they're not that noisy. And they have a nice little door that opens up, and it's just so small and convenient. I'm very impressed with the design of the smaller PlayStation 2. It doesn't even feel cheap. How can it when Red Faction is sitting inside? How much weight did they cut? Well, let's do a scientific game room review analysis to find out using a baking scale. Let's turn this on. All right, the original PlayStation 2 weighs in at a tubby 5 pounds and 7 1/4 ounces. Somebody quit feeding this thing donuts. Let's weigh the smaller PlayStation 2, the model SCPH 79001. 1 pound, 6 1/4 ounces. Let's take a look at the back of the PlayStation 2s. This one has more junk in the trunk. It has a giant fan, computer-style power switch with the network adapter. There's the network thing, and that's where the power cord would go. And here's where your audio and video cables would go. And if you have component or good AV cables from your original PlayStation 2, they will work on the newer, smaller PlayStation 2 because they use the exact same cables. This is where the external power supply plugs into. Here's your optical audio port and network cable. Very subtle styling on it as well. Power button's over here. Here's where you push the button to open the door. I've previously reviewed the SCPH 90000. This is the Japanese model. You can see there's some slight differences between these two, most notably in the fact that this has an internal power supply and the 79001 has an external power supply. There's also some external design cue differences. They took this one ridge off of the front of it here. It looks a little bit sleeker. Also, if we look at the side, you can see there's some differences in the molding, and the back is also slightly different. Pretty much the same thing though. As of this recording, the Sony PlayStation 2 is the best-selling video game console ever. More of these have sold than the Vectrex. That's incredible, showing the strength of the PlayStation 2 and its massive video game library, thanks to its backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1 games and a huge selection of PS2 titles. If you're going to buy one, go small. Go with the PlayStation 2 Slim model, the 79001, or the 90000. How do they number these things? It's like they just make up random numbers. I'd like the model 90057 and a half. It's backwards compatible with the Vectrex. That's an amazing number, not just because of how light it is, but because Red Faction is inside, and that's 1,000 pounds of awesome. Feed me. This is my Nintendo DS, and I like my DS how I like my coffee, hot and black. The packaging lies in this shot. The stylus is writing all by itself. It doesn't actually do that. Beneath all of these fingerprints on the protective coating is a very exciting handheld game console, the Nintendo DS Lite. Not the DSi, not the original DS, the Lite, which is lighter than the original one. It's a bit smaller, and it still plays Game Boy Advance games. I just flipped everyone off. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. That's my bad. Just in case you weren't sure, games are sold separately. If you look beyond the obvious facts that this thing has 2 screens and works with a touch screen and stylus for many games, this is, in my opinion, like the portable PlayStation 2, because of the sheer vast number of games available for it, and the fact that it's backwards compatible with the Game Boy Advance, giving you thousands of games to play. It has a badass flip screen case, and this thing is from Nintendo, so it's built like a tank. Very rugged. I like that for a portable game console. And while it's maybe not the most technologically advanced handheld, it doesn't have the best graphics, it's not very good for 3D style games, there's a never-ending supply of affordable games for this thing. Were I not filming classic game room reviews with this, I probably would have chosen a different color because the black gets fingerprints very easily. But since I filmed the screen, black stays out of the way. The easiest. There's a variety of different colors available for the Nintendo DS. You can even get it in pink, fellas. When it comes to styling, I actually prefer the older sibling, the Game Boy Advance SP, which I think has a better screen, and I like the design better anyway, and the buttons. But they both share something in common here, a protective shell, which is nice. This way you can throw it in your pocket and travel and not worry about scratching up the screen. I use little rubber feet on the bottom of all of these because I film the screens, and as this is the Nintendo DS Lite, it will play Game Boy Advance video games. There's Mario Kart Super Circuit, an excellent one. So you pull out this little protective thing that they have on the bottom of the DS here. Let's get focus. And that goes right there. After you turn on the DS, it gives you an option on the bottom screen to start Game Boy Advance game, and when you push that, it starts playing on the top screen. It does a slight letterboxing effect because of the aspect ratio difference between the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS, but it still looks very good, and most importantly, it works. Sadly, this does not play old school Game Boy cartridges. For that, you need an old school Game Boy Advance, or the SP, which is my preferred model. There's a power switch on the side here for the DS. We'll just give that a push. Turns off the game console. This is the underside of the Nintendo DS Lite, covered in fingerprints. It does not come with these rubber feet. Those are custom. And this is where the Nintendo DS games go. We'll insert the Dark Spire, my 2009 Game of the Year. Clicks into place. Like I said in the beginning of the review, I think the strongest feature of this thing is not necessarily the touch screen or the dual screens, but just the variety of games, because no matter what kind of video games you enjoy, the Nintendo DS has you covered. I said the exact same thing about the PlayStation 2. The number of games is important because you don't want to be stuck with just a handful of games to choose from. I turned off the lights so that we could see the screen better. Another thing I like about the DS is that the selection of games is affordable. Even new releases are practically half the cost of other big budget releases. Used games are dirt cheap. Even the Nintendo DS itself really isn't all that expensive. Now, most of the games will use the dual split screen for some kind of effect in the gameplay. Let's start the Dark Spire here. This is a game that uses it extremely well because the bottom screen has all of the information and the top screen shows you where you're moving. It's like a old school dungeon crawler. One of my favorite games, one that I play all the time on my Nintendo DS. See, there's the top screen, and the bottom screen shows me my party health. I can pull up all my magic spells, stuff like that. Well, that guy doesn't have any spells. Let me find someone who does. There we go. Awesome. Okay, well, let's just go through this door here. Here we go. I've encountered some enemies, some goblins. Some games for the DS will force you to use the stylus at all times. Others let you use the buttons, which I prefer. It's like unsheathing a sword. All right, let's take a look at a game that uses the Nintendo DS stylus effectively and not gimmick-y. We'll go with the UK release, Seven Wonders 2, a fun puzzle game, and I can play this because of the lack of region encoding on the Nintendo DS, all the way over here across the pond in the US. So start the game up and show you a nice game that works with the stylus. For being so small, this thing has surprisingly good sound, and it's in stereo. You can also use your headphones. There's a headphone jack on the front of the console down here. There we go. This is one of their big selling points. So you just grab something lightly, slide it around. It works fairly well. Eventually you'll find that your screen gets scratched up a little bit, but it's really not that big of a deal. Here's your start and select button. There's also buttons up here on the top, in addition to all of the other ones that you see. Fairly traditional Nintendo-style D-pad, slight texturing in the plastic. The buttons are also slightly textured and feel nice. You can really hammer on this thing and it just keeps on working, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. The DS also has Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, where you can find friends and begin racing, battling, or chatting as easily as if they were sitting in the same room. Do you really want to even sit in the same room with your friends? Who does? That's why this has the Wi-Fi connection. Another thing that I like about the DS is that it has a clear rival, the Sony PSP. And unlike the big competing game consoles, primarily the PS3 and the Xbox 360, these two are actually different. So it reminds me of the old days when it was like Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo. Both awesome game systems, but completely different with a different selection of games. This is the one that you get if you want bigger games with better graphics, bigger sound, like shooting games and driving games. This is the one that you get if you like a larger library of games, more puzzle games, role-playing games, adventure.
Banished from Earth Classic Game Room broadcasts from the intergalactic space arcade on its never-ending mission to review everything. Sit back and relax because I'm reviewing one of the greatest Nintendo game systems ever created that's not even from Nintendo. This is the Analogue NT Mini, which plays NES games like Mag Max and Famicom games like Bird Week. Mag Max loves Bird Week. Bird Week, Bird Week, Bird Week. From the makers of the CMVS Slim and Analogue NT comes the Gamecom Platinum, crafted from a solid block of platinum. No, I'm just kidding. I'll use its pen to point at the Analogue NT Mini, which is crafted from a solid block of dolomite. It's not, but it should be. You can also get this in silver. It's an ultra high-end NES and Famicom. A game system whose price matches its performance, or is it the other way around? This is a badass NES and Famicom that does pretty much everything, except it does lack blast processing. Aside from that, it's great. A few years ago, I reviewed the original Analogue NT. This one has some improvements and refinements like native HDMI support,
a cool see-through bottom wireless controller, and smoother dust flaps, among other things. Read Analogue's website for details, but the Analogue NT has a lot of power under the hood and outputs HDMI, RGB, as well as S-Video and Composite. What it doesn't do is play Musha, what it does do is play Xanac, and that's good. No emulation here, this is straight off the game cartridge via HDMI. You can pull up an on-screen menu at any time. Did I mention it has a built-in Game Genie so that you can turn the codes on and off as you're playing the game? Here's a shot of the Analogue NT Mini being played via S-Video. It's an absolutely wonderful game console, but it's not cheap. Here's the thing. There's no NES or Famicom hardware that is cheap, especially if it's in good working order. So if you look at the Analogue NT Mini as a long-term investment, it's a great option. It's firmware upgradable. Analogue is a wonderful company. I've been reviewing their stuff for years. As you can see, this thing works with the Famicom disk system, and pretty much whatever Nintendo or Famicom accessories you throw at it, like my personal favorite, NES Advantage. It'll also work with the Famicom microphone games, and any additional special Famicom joysticks you might have. Sure, there's less expensive options out there and numerous knockoff NES and Famicom models to choose from, but nothing quite like this.
Max thinks it. Oh my head! My robot head!
But if you look at it like a modern game system, it makes complete sense. And what modern game system has a catalog that's half as good as the NES game library? Except maybe the Vectrex, but that brings me to my next point. Analogue, I know you're listening. Instead of making solid gold Analogue NTs, and yes, they have done this, how about a new Vectrex? Because they're really in short supply. If anyone can remake the Vectrex, this time with wood grain, please, it's you. Until then, I highly recommend the Analogue NT Mini. There's nothing mini about it, it delivers big fun.
As long as that big fun includes Magmax. Oh my legs!
Classic Game Room is brought to you by Ethel the Cyborg Ninja, now on Amazon and Classic Game Room Barware.